Forged secretly in mortuary archaeology's hottest furnace, it's Archaeodeath.
Archaeodeathlings, welcome to another Archaeodeath interview. And we're, of course, on Archaeodeath going into deathly topics, and what could be more deathly than Victorian paranormal-y stuff? And that's the question. So we're here to discuss what could be more deathly than that with Kate. Kate, please introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Okay, I'm Kate Cherrell. I'm a writer and broadcaster. I'm best known. That sounds horribly egotistical, doesn't it? I mainly work as a paranormal historian these days, which does sound, it's incredibly spooky. It does sound like a bit of a contradiction in terms, but it broadly covers everything from ghost experiences, like the cultural importance of ghosts, a lot of spiritualism, that's kind of my main academic interest, changing relationships with the afterlife, and of course, a lot of things to do with miserable Victorians and contemporary paranormal cultures. So honestly, I'm an absolute joy at dinner parties. I will kill that conversation dead at the earliest opportunity.
If I'm ever invited to a dinner party, I'd hope you'd be there too. But it never happens to me. But no, but seriously, these are the best dinner party ideas. This is what people want to talk about. They don't want to talk about, who's getting their MOT next or whatever. Maybe some people do, but real cool people want to talk about paranormal, deathly stuff, spiritualism, and all that. And I really wanted to, because I deal with a lot of material. Archaeology is a material aspects of our landscape, the tombs, the material cultures of death, and the landscape of death, from prehistory, and I teach my students that. But throughout my teaching, I'm always dealing with the spiritual, past people's perceptions of the spiritual, and modern day engagements with those aspects. And I love the fact that you tap between, what people perceived in the past or thought about in the past and how people are engaging with these places today. So, how did you get to be this? How does that happen? How do you get to be a moment in your life where you can call yourself a paranormal historian? And why hasn't that happened to me?
Well, no, you've got a far more solid background than me. It's odd, really. It's one of those strange little flow charts of life where everything just seemed to feed in. Like so many people that have an interest in anything deathly or ghostly, I've sort of nurtured a lifelong interest in these sort of things. And then when I went into higher education, I mainly was in creative practice. I was mainly in writing and in literature as well, mainly 19th century and Victorian Gothic. And then I started to really integrate my interests with burial spaces and the history of ghost stories into this sort of wider work where I begin to straddle these like multiple worlds. There's a weird Venn diagram where things like archaeology, contemporary cultural history, and goodness knows what, 19th century history. There's a little bit in the centre, and that's where I've made my tiny little nest. But I've participated in those worlds in very different ways over the years, and I've done the whole TV ghost hunting thing. I've done that. I've done multiple TV shows hunting for ghosts. I've appeared as paranormal experts, just delivering the history on mediums and things like that as well. And that's kind of my real love, is that I think if you've got some kind of literary academic background and you're interested in death cultures and the way people interacted with death spaces and different attitudes to the afterlife, you're going to ask more questions. You're going to be asking, well, if people believed during this interwar period that ghosts were coming into their house, why did they? What else was culturally happening around that time? And then obviously then questions and answers come forward saying, well, maybe people wanted to bring the war dead back into the domestic space. And it becomes this secondary history that's running alongside this kind of mainstream accepted history, because it's all well and good in academia that we can make reference to the history of ghost stories or the history of burial practice and arcane beliefs, but to actually delve into them and to treat them not as dead beliefs, but as active beliefs and things that enormously informed the cultural tides of the time. I think that's when we can get something really interesting. Doesn't please everyone. Not everyone wants to hear me coming into a conference and talk about how important female mediums were in the 1870s when it comes to the world of medical journalism, for example. But someone's got to be that irritating person, and I'm happy that it's me.
But Kate, the way you pitch that, it almost sounds like, and this is what I keep forgetting, because I don't know, I won't pretend I'm the most enlightened person in terms of academia, but I thought we would be generations beyond that kind of attitude, but we haven't really come far in terms of, there still seems to be, and tell me if I'm wrong, not only various race and class divides and difficulties with topic of historians or any history related subjects discusses, but of course a huge gender issue here with how people don't think value topics that are to do with women in the past and children in the past. There's all I would have thought when I was learning in the 90s about the feminist archaeology and archaeology of class and power and all that neo-Marxist stuff that was already long been around 20-30 years, but was certainly well embedded into archaeology in the 80s and 90s. I thought by now we'd be overcoming these kind of things, but it sounds like you're almost daring to suggest that we're still in that kind of, you have to justify yourself or struggle against, why is this even relevant to an academic space? Am I getting that vibe?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think there's a lot of women's histories, particularly relating to spiritualism, the paranormal, the history of esoteric belief, that are very much sidelined in favour for something that's easier to fit into a kind of taxonomy of understanding. And I think there's also a big element of classism. I've certainly noticed that with more projects and papers that I've been involved with that have taken a more contemporary interest in developing fields. Like, for example, I do a lot with the paranormal community, as in people that go ghost hunting in the modern term. And a lot of the people that do this, and a lot of the people that find their identities and their communities and their worth, for really want of a better term, a lot of those people are in working class communities and form deeply meaningful relationships and have new ways of communicating. There are new ways of behaving. There are new. It's like these whole little microcosms of community spring up. But if you want to then address those in an academic space, in a conference space, unless that space is something like the SPR or the ASSEP conferences, these ones that are dedicated to the study of anomalous phenomena or parapsychology, there's just been this wave of dismissal of, oh God, aren't they silly? And there's this real sort of vile thread, I think, to intellectualism that comes along and really tries to kick the legs out from under contemporary working class cultures that have that spiritual bent to them that we don't really address, because I think to then try and make these cultures worthy of great study would mean that we have to really risk our reputations. In doing so. Luckily for me, most people think I'm a nutter anyway, so I don't have much to lose. But I think that's something that we're going to come up across a lot more, that there's not just going to be issues with studying women's history and esoteric history, but there's the real issue with considering contemporary working class communities and how these new relationships with religion, spirituality, new relationships with death are really developing before us.
And I don't know what the meta-narrative would be, and do correct me, but so much has been written about secularization, medicalization of death and the professionalization of death from the 18th, 19th century, but particularly into the 20th. And from what you're saying, it seems to be that the spiritual dimensions are at least one avenue by which working class people acquire, retain, or try to articulate agency over their relationship with the dead, which is often sort of funneled out, or within the process they can't necessarily, they've got the formal gravestone, the vicar's in charge of one bit of the funeral, where is the space where they can connect with their loved ones in a way that is meaningful to them? Am I in the right ballpark area, or is that something you would consider a fair point? I'm way outside my area of expertise here, so I'm just sort of pointing out things that come to mind rather than expounding theses I've actually read up on.
I think people's relationship with death, certainly post-COVID, has changed enormously, and the prevalence of a kind of nebulous, non-specific spirituality has really ingrained itself a lot more across various cultures and across different subcultures as well. So I think people's relationships with spirituality today in a post-COVID Britain are far more akin to those of their Victorian forebears. There's far more consideration of superstitions and talismans, things like we'll see more people today reference feathers in a house being a signal that a spirit, an angel, even if a person considers themselves to be completely irreligious, they'll start taking these little symbolic talismans as a kind of moving, ever-changing new spirituality that doesn't necessarily follow any type of framework or any doesn't have any tenets at all. But I'm seeing that a lot more. There's a lot more openness to New Age, even with the latest the eclipse the other week. The amount of people who I would never would have considered them to be religious or spiritual or even consider anything about the continuation of the human soul after death, they were out there charging their crystals or leaving moon water out or different bowls of water. And so people are participating actively in elements, if not whole rituals, of things that are would have been considered rather more left field. And I think we see that as well in the way that we memorialise people today as well. We're getting so many threads coming back from the 19th century. So although I waffle on about spiritualism most of the time, when it comes to the way that we keep the dead with us and the way that we change our behaviours with the mourning period seems to have developed a lot more as well. People are far more open to keeping tangible parts of their loved ones with them by way of ashes, jewellery, like you can compress ashes into diamond-esque gemstones. The jet industry isn't exactly booming, but certainly the association with mourning and deliberately displaying that mourning and hair jewellery in a very small way is also coming back. People are still wanting those tangible talismans, those tangible links to deceased loved ones, and seeing that as a kind of perpetual spiritual link as well, even if it's just as simple as I've got a locket with my granddad's photo on it. They weren't really terribly popular for the decades preceding us, because a lot of this really fell out of popularity on a large scale in the 1940s. There were a few really big exhibitions that did these grand Victorian retrospectives on mourning cultures that today, I think there'd be certainly a lot of goths picketing them if they tried to do it today. But there were some quite substantial exhibitions over here and in the US that reframed mourning cultures and reframed mourning jewellery as being particularly morbid and unhealthy. And in some instances, they just told outright lies, like hair work could, where strands of someone's hair was woven into various different types of jewellery, that hair could carry diseases like the plague. So then you have, which is nonsense, absolute nonsense. So you had these generations coming forward with these completely subverted views of what mourning and love was, that it was something physically dirty, not just emotionally dirty or culturally dirty. It was something that you actively had to get out of your house.
I find it deeply ironic that in dismissing sort of spiritual and seemingly superstitious ideas, people are inventing whole pseudoscientific ideas. It's deeply ironic to see that. But I mean, that's what I was going to ask is we have waves of reaction to perceived periodizations of past practice, and the Victorian and Edwardian are captured in but would you therefore say, and I don't think you will, but it's a deliberate, active retro subculture that draws on goth and new age that has tried to connect back to that? Or is it more of a messy, confused, which I think is where you're probably going to suggest, not really an attempt to like steampunk the Victorian age into a new era of hair jewelry, or it's more of a sort of selective and creative practice. I don't know. I haven't got my handle on it really.
Yeah, I think it's. I don't think it's especially messy, but I think there's probably parallel schools of thought that have brought it back in a kind of weird symbiotic relationship. I think there's certainly the goth steampunk element, the romanticization of very select parts of the 19th century mourning process have brought back a lot of aesthetics, aesthetic movements in a certain Gothic angle. You'll see a lot more hand jewelry, a lot more small Gothic makers saying that they're making a mourning collection, and it'll be a handful of often repeated cemetery symbols cast in resin, silver plate, things like that. It's very much the inoffensive, the easily swallowable form of the Victorians that's coming through the goth side of things. There's certainly the aesthetics there, but conversely, we see so much memorial jewelry, and well, there's another thread after that really, but we see so much memorial jewelry in modern Britain today that doesn't really have a direct link to certainly Victorian jewelry styles or even manufacturing techniques. So there seems to be kind of like a deliberate separation, as in, we'll make something to remember your mum, but don't worry, we're not weird and creepy like the Victorians, we're doing it new. So there's that, again, you've got this weird sort of deliberate lexical separation from the two. So you've got the goths that are buying into the deepest, darkest aesthetics of it, and then the more mainstream, I don't want to say sanitized, because it's not sanitized. No. It's gentler. I'd say gentler way of looking at.
You can't attribute it all to those that watch Bram Stoker's Dracula one too many times, or those that watch a particular favourite character in a soap opera did something, and then there was a craze. You can't pinpoint it to one pop culture trend or something. It's a much more deeper, richer, because it is. It's everyone's individual experience, isn't it? And I see this when I go in graveyards and churchyards, I should say, and cemeteries, and you see what the choices people make of the objects they put with the dead, and some of them are genuinely the objects that person had as alive, and others they're clearly remembering birthdays, adding objects, and what do they hope those objects would? I talk to my students about this. Do these people? I don't want to jump out behind a gravestone and go, "Oi, why are you putting that there?" But as archaeologists, I'm speculating. Speculating, what are these people genuinely thinking it through, or does that not matter, that it's just an idea they're connecting through a thing that to the dead? It's not always easy to work out, is it?
No, I think we always get these returns to sort of personal ritual that have the most basic core, and that core is a loss and a desire to be reunited. We seem to get these revivals of interest within everything from spirituality to mourning cultures to tangible mourning jewelry after periods of great national loss. So I think COVID really has reshaped the way that we interact with our dead, and the way we interact with grave spaces as well. And so I think when you track that back through various epidemics, pandemics, wars, we'll kind of get the same. I think we so often think that we're having unique experiences and unique thoughts, and all you have to do is go back 50 years and realize, oh no, we're just wearing slightly tighter trousers. We're exactly the same people.
So how do you handle this relationship between people believing in spirits and ghosts and the stories about them, and the tangible spaces of death, the grave, the cemetery? How do you? Because you're obviously fascinated by stories, but you're also a great storyteller yourself, and so it seems to be that story is the way you connect, which means you don't have to. You're not about there validating or vindicating a particular belief. You're here about exploring the cultural phenomenon. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think the least interesting thing about ghosts, paranormal investigation, ghost stories, the whole umbrella, the least interesting thing about it is whether or not ghosts are real.
Yeah.
And I can't see how that could possibly be the greatest thing, because to define if something's real, then you've got to define a ghost. And then if you take in all the great grand spooky tree of ghost variations, you'd be here for years trying to define each and every one of them. So I think ghosts are most interesting when they can tell us something about ourselves. So ghost stories, traditional ghost stories, certainly have a purpose, and that purpose is so intrinsically linked to place. I find that really interesting. Like in geographically, you'll see such differences between ghost stories that they're almost like different breeds around the country. Say, like in Cornwall, you'll have these amazing traditional ghost stories about dead pirates on the beach, and these things that haunt late at night on the coast. And the stories are interesting in themselves, but then when you look back at the time they were being told, the cultural influence and the functionality that those stories would have had, they were really useful because they'd keep the beaches clear for smugglers to come in and then unload their stuff because everyone was too scared of the ghosts. And I find that so interesting, that we're all being informed subconsciously by centuries and centuries of ghost stories. You just have to look on social media for 2 minutes and someone will put up some hideous AI generated meme saying, would you spend a night in a cemetery for £1,000?
Yeah.
If so.
Sorry, that wasn't a question. Sorry.
So, first of all, I have done for minimum wage. It's not like this amazing thing. But we're so informed by these, by literature, by traditional storytelling, that we're never free from ghosts. We are all informed and we all interact with our environment differently because of ghost stories. People go to National Trust properties and they'll try and be all classy and have their little scone and tea and wear their best shoes. And then in the same breath, they'll be going, have you got any ghost stories? Because we've got that intrinsic link, that cultural link with old building equals ghosts, because we've been so fed for centuries this idea that buildings retain memories, tangible memories in the form of ghosts or manifestations or spectres. And I find that endlessly fascinating. But when it comes to burial spaces, I think that's when I come to a lot of difficulties, because as someone who I've written about and blogged about graves, not from an archaeological perspective.
Yeah.
The nearest I've got to an archaeology qualification is like binge watching Time Team every time I'm poorly.
Now, because I basically have validated that now, literally just now.
Excellent.
So you've got a BA Time Team Studies now.
Amazing.
I'll send you the certificate in the post.
Fantastic. That's going straight on the CV. But I think the way that a lot of ghost stories are linked with burial spaces is one of the few times where I think that can be very, very, it can be damaging and it can be incredibly helpful. There's this real dichotomy within burial spaces that I find myself being very uncomfortable about. That I find ghost stories about cemeteries, by cemeteries I mean like cemeteries, burial grounds, churchyards, burial spaces.
The range of
I find them to be very interesting because they reveal a lot about our relationship with death and our changing relationship with the aesthetics of death, because a lot of our ghost stories around burial spaces pretty much emerge in the mid to late 19th century, where a lot of burial stuff, well, we get the dawn of the cemetery for starters, but then we get these really grand burial styles. We get the rise of neo-Gothic in cemetery architecture. So it's all feeding into itself along with this Victorian obsession with ghost stories. So I understand where a lot of those stories come from. But then they can be very damaging, because then when those cemeteries went out of commission, because turns out burial in perpetuity is a really crap business model, when they went out of commission in like the 70s and they became very overgrown and many became backdrops for Hammer horror films, then we get this second relationship with this othering of burial spaces, especially Victorian burial spaces. And I think that's where we get a lot of our tricky relationships with burial spaces today. And that's why I think so many people are drawn, in terms of like paranormal investigations, to those spaces. They're not necessarily just informed by the idea that bodies are here, dead people are here. They're informed by that cultural pool of Hammer horror, Victorian Gothic, of these spaces being these kind of othered. I'm loath to say liminal because I feel like everyone should be fined nowadays every time we say it. But these othered liminal spaces.
I'm as bad.
Oh, and it's like a tick. I just can't stop saying it's a liminal space.
I'm guilty.
Yeah. So I think I have a lot of opinions with burial spaces.
If I was going to press you, because I'm not saying this is my views, but if I was going to press you on what I would imagine, I'd love your reaction. If I was going to say what are the potential dangers of paranormal people investigations in churchyards and cemeteries linked to ghost stories, or it would be the mass, inspiration by TV, that scale of people flocking that could cause accidental damage. But then the actually people digging, disturbing, breaking in. It's more urban explorers than any paranormal people, but the urban explorer breaking into crypts, breaking into damage, and then of course at the farthest extreme linked to that, we do have people that there are people who there is a trade in human remains, so not only draws on the developing world, but also as we've seen in the States recently, people actually ransacking, and it always differentially affects black and brown communities more than white, but it could potentially affect everyone. So if I was going to characterize that as a broader problem, I'm not putting at the door of paranormal or spiritual, but those kind of potential intersections. But there's also, I suppose, the denigration of particular traditions, because we're all we default to a Christian tradition. But if you're dealing with Muslim, Jewish, or particular denominations that are marginalized, Quakers, or there could be potential, negative associations. That's the kind of area I go to. But am I in the wrong area? Is that not what you're talking about? Do you think any of those things are
Yeah, it's a massive, massive field. It's goodness, right? How to bring all that down? So sorry, I think
I've never talked about this before in terms with someone with your expertise, so I wasn't sure where to go with it. But that was what I was thinking.
No, it's a particular interest of mine. So I think the only times really, I think there's a bit of. There's this idea that people that go in to do paranormal investigations are actively damaging burial spaces. And I'd say for the most part, they're not. No. Not saying they're not causing damage, but I think that damage is more ethical and legal. So I think those are the main problems with that, unless we go back to cases like the Highgate vampire hysteria in the 1970s into the 1980s, where there was this... that's another enormous story, but there was a belief that a vampire was dwelling within Highgate. This was when Highgate was very overgrown and was closed to the public. And there were two warring occultists who both claimed almost ownership of the vampire. They claimed superior knowledge of this vampire, and the stories spread far and wide. One was going in saying that he'd seen the vampire, and it came to a head one night where there was almost like a literal riot at Highgate. It featured on the local. This. Yeah. It's the Highgate vampire is an amazing case. It had gone on local news, and round the gates of Highgate were hundreds of people who'd all just come down to kind of fight this vampire in Old Highgate Cemetery. They were scaling the walls and things, and there was an awful lot of damage done, not just by the people that joined this sort of vampire brawl, this failed vampire hunt. The police pretty much put an end to that. They, back in the 70s and 80s, they could whip them batons out with no issue at all. But prior to that, with the occultists, certainly one of them going into Highgate, he claimed to have opened some tombs, and particularly one that the vampire was within, and staked the vampire's corpse. And he was found to have opened a Victorian tomb and to have desecrated the body. And he received prison time for this.
Good. I didn't know about this, I must admit.
Yeah. So
shame on me.
So it's interesting. This is a whole rabbit hole that you can lose your weekend to. It's an absolutely fascinating study in contemporary hysteria, really. But that, I think, is kind of the worst case scenario of what can happen when there is a perception that there is a ghost or some sort of supernatural being within a cemetery. And there have been a lot of damage in various sites all across the world because of kind of copycat instances, people believing that they're going into burial spaces to fight some kind of supernatural evil. And then, well, like I said, I think when it comes to paranormal investigators, they're not really going to be the ones to be opening tombs. If they cross over with urban exploration, they might go into some mausoleums.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of, yeah.
And I find that to be, I mean, we've all got that nosy aspect. If you've ever gone to a grand Victorian cemetery, you're going to press your nose up against the glass of a mausoleum to go, oh, wow, that's decorated. Oh, that's interesting. But I think there is a big difference between that and forcing a lock or breaking glass. Yeah, so I feel like that's a rarity in the paranormal world. But then we have the wider ethical issues that come from these burial space investigations, and a lot of those, I think, they're seen best in live streamed investigations. So if someone's curated their own online platform, whether as a team or as an individual, again, I'd never realized I'd referenced the pandemic this much, but it really escalated during the pandemic, where paranormal investigators who would commonly go to rented properties, different spaces, different public spaces to do investigations, found that their world was closed down, and the only place that they felt that they could go to make that same content were these outdoor burial spaces, because there's this perception of public ownership. And I think that's where there's a real paucity of understanding of burial space ownership and burial space behavioral expectations as well. So I think I saw so many investigations from enormous live streamers and smaller groups as well that would put these investigations up under a banner of the abandoned cemetery, the forgotten graves. And there was this perception of there's not only discovery, but we're not just discovering the graves, we're discovering these kind of arcane beings that may be dwelling within them, with little and so while you've got these Victorian ones, you've also got people going into cemeteries that are still working, that are still actively accepting burials, and I see an awful lot of those. I did a study a few years ago with a friend of mine about how cemeteries are dealing with this, and we presented it at conferences and got so obsessed with it that like 4 years later we still haven't published the final findings. We're still endlessly faffing, so maybe this is the kick up the backside I need.
I want to see it.
Yeah, it's got me in a bit of trouble in some corners.
but yes, go on. Yeah.
Oh, but the issues with it being live streamed is that some more prominent names who were live streaming from named cemeteries were taking their paranormal equipment, so things like flashing cat balls, these like cat toys that flash with LED lights when they're moved, REM pods, word banks, things that make sounds or produce seemingly relevant words when placed near a relevant site. They were using this equipment on identifiable modern graves and then live streaming them. And there were some instances where people from the same area saw, recommended by Facebook or whatever, that so-and-so was doing a live stream, and they saw the grave of a loved one be used in that individual's investigation. And that's where we get these enormous ethical quandaries, where you've got this perception of public space, but it's not publicly owned. It's either privately, council owned. But then we had so many other instances of these investigators going in, believing that they not only were allowed to because it was a public space, but because they had a loved one buried there themselves. And so that extended this perceived ownership over everyone else's grave. And then there's the legal issues therein, because it could be civil trespass, but also if you're accepting financial reward from these live streams, which a lot of people were, then it's also conducting your business, in a differently owned site. So there've been some quite interesting legal letters sent out over the last 6 years from these investigations. But a lot of people that went in were wearing things that kind of gave them a perceived authority, which I found quite an interesting angle. A lot of the investigators that we studied between about 2020 to about 23, or 23, 24, they would go into these burial sites wearing things like tactical vests.
Yeah.
So almost looking
like fighting the dead, you need that kind of that Amazon or eBay purchase, TikTok shop. Get the tactical gear. Yeah.
I mean, where else are you going to put the Twix? Yeah. So that there was this perceived authority as well when these people went in, because they were, like you say, they looked professional, but they could also be seen as security guards. So in a lot of instances, they weren't questioned because they looked like they were supposed to be there. So
oh my God. There's a whole. This is really true, because people have analysed how people dress up to be archaeologists. So there's an archaeology aesthetic, and like the fedora and the there's the beige colonial gear, but there's also there's a whole blurring between paramilitary through to investigator, crime scene, emergency services, that people sort of cosplay to do this stuff. And it's fascinating. Sorry,
no, that's really interesting. It is. It's strange. If you put that person in a paranormal situation, you'd go, oh yeah, they're going on an investigation. For some reason, they need all of it strapped to their body for some reason. But when you then place it in a burial space, it's very different. But it became so unavoidable for many years that my friend and I, both of us, have worked in cemeteries. She still does. I did for a period of time. That a lot of cemeteries were communicating with one another saying, we don't know what to do with this. We've never had this issue before. And we're getting people coming in live streaming, every night. And it was mainly live stream, because it's hard to catch someone if they're doing it on their own for their own personal spiritual development, which I weirdly have less of an issue with. Not that I think it's a great idea, because I don't think really anyone should be doing paranormal investigations in burial spaces. But it was the idea that a lot of these things were being monetized that I found particularly ethically problematic. But it's a huge field, and people are still doing it today. No matter how much I annoy them, they're still doing it.
But you can certainly lead by example. If I was going to shift onto this later, but certainly your own content that I've perceived, where you are going into burial places, telling the stories about individual graves or the broader space. I want to put you on a pedestal here, because I think you're doing a really effective, balance of, you're not, there's nothing, it's very carefully couched. And obviously this has taken years to develop, and I could tell, because I see a lot of stuff that makes me wince, and I never had a single wince or moment when I'm watching your stuff, because it's quite clearly respectful, but also not to the point of this cringy deference people do, like, oh, in a burial space, got to quietly, whisper quietly, got to wear. No, it's like, here we are in a living space and a cultural landscape. Let's talk about this story. It's no nonsense, and I really appreciated that, because I see a lot of stuff that doesn't do that. Either tries this over, oh, I'm an academic, I've got to be respectful to the point of, or just, oh guys, here we are.
There's a happy medium between whispering and cartweening, definitely.
Yes, I haven't seen either of those things, certainly not the cartweening, but feel free to try it on the paths.
Not with my wrists, not a cat and else chance.
No, but seriously, you'd think it'd be easy to, it would be obvious. There's a massive territory where most people are not going to be infringing on ethical concerns. There's so much you can do in cemeteries to share stories about our past for the present, whether it's related to ghosts or it's related to the lives lived or a particular aspect. There's so many ways you can do things without messing it up. It's amazing the number of people who just launch straight in, literally, into those spaces and find ways of being just problematic.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's also a lot of people don't understand today just how good so many big Victorian cemeteries are for the community as well. They are, like you said, they're active, they're living spaces. So many brilliant cemeteries today have been, pardon the pun, they've been resurrected by cemetery trusts. They have event spaces, they have tours, they have wedding spaces, they still do funerals, even if they're not really accepting burials. There are so many ways that these once grand Victorian cemeteries are now able to generate revenue to preserve these sites, but then the very presence of events can then be perceived by others to be disrespectful. And I have a big issue with the word disrespectful because it's so subjective. It's like that's my little anger word.
Let's do a defence then. We've talked about some of the ethical and practical damage that paranormal stuff can do. Let's isolate some of the really key ways in which paranormal heritage, or if you can call it that, can, involving history, archaeology, folklore, can actually be part of that broader revitalization, that broader educational, let's give it a bit of a defense as well.
Yes. Oh yeah, I don't mean to give the paranormal a kick. It's a huge part of my life.
Yes, of course.
But I think one of the greatest contributions that the paranormal brings to heritage is, once again, its revenue. Because so many people that go on paranormal investigations, you'll meet someone, they say, oh yeah, I do a bit of ghost hunting. How long have you been doing it? 20 years, 30 years. Yeah. And so they'll have seen everything. They'll have done every pub down the street, but they want to investigate this grand manor. They want to visit, investigate this different heritage space, this museum. It's amazing. So many places, and especially museums actually around the country, open up afternoon hire, so after they've closed to the public, like evening hire, night hire, to paranormal investigators to generate more revenue that normally that just would have been dead time. They wouldn't have been earning anything. So there are so many opportunities for heritage spaces to keep themselves afloat by welcoming paranormal investigations and paranormal investigators. And there are dedicated consultants for this. There's a really great consultancy in the Southwest called Just Paranormal Consultant, and they liaise with heritage sites and museums to give them sort of, the package really of how to get started with hosting paranormal investigations, because so many people will hear that, and so many trusts will hear that and go, oh no, we're not having, Doris Stokes and 500 weeping grannies in our museum. We're not having people summoning the devil around the back of the gift shop. Whereas in reality, it's going to be 20 people in fleeces sitting in silence. It's not really going to cause any harm or any distress, but you're going to generate a good amount of revenue. And then that, in turn, if you're a good site, a good location, your reputation will grow. More people will know the stories there. They'll celebrate the histories. And then people are more inclined, if they're solely invested in the paranormal space, they're more inclined to then participate in different heritage activities outside of that, from preservation through to fundraising. There are so many amazing instances of sites being saved, really, through the intervention of paranormal teams who then go on and say, oh, actually, I've bought all these books about the person who founded this place. I'm going on these talks, these tours. History and the paranormal is intrinsically interlinked, and a lot of people find their way into wider fields of heritage, storytelling, history through that little ghosty inlet. So I think it has an enormous positive influence on heritage sites.
That's really interesting you say that, because I think by self-selection people don't admit their interests in this area to me, as assuming my attitude will be aggressive. And I must admit, my online profile has seen me being quite damning of individuals who have done specific things, but that's not because of a blanket prejudice or dislike for paranormal investigators or those that engage with sites in those terms. My only objection is when someone from America flies to a certain country in Europe, to a certain site where a certain 1930s and 40s regime had professors identifying it as the heart of ancient pagan Germanic culture, cramming himself into a medieval sarcophagus and using his special paranormal equipment, having a conversation with his ancestors who tell him to rise up against the globalist elites. And we must, and of course, like 99% of my comments are, I don't see the connections, bro. I can't see why you're calling him a extremist. I can't see why you're calling him a neo. Yeah, and I'm saying, well, so it's not about paranormal. It's about a very specific, that when I see those kind of instances, or people literally co-opting UNESCO World Heritage sites, not necessarily for paranormal stuff, but for far right extremist events when they're literally the best friends of well-known politicians that are hate mongers, then I raise a comment. I'm not going around the internet policing everyone going to the grave and telling a ghost story. That's not my So I think people do tend to think, because I'm a professional, and I think part of the problem is particularly Americans, because a lot of my American archaeology and anthropology colleagues are fighting a really tough, divided fight against pseudo-archaeology in all its forms, and they tend to lump anyone who's interested in ghost stories in as, they're all tainted by, they're all from the same poisoned, they don't believe the true scientific approach. And I must admit, in Britain, I think we're a lot more relaxed about this, and we see many creative ways of engaging with heritage, folklore, spaces, and I've never been that kind of doctrinal hardline fundamentalist, because I think it just shuts down conversations and it tars everyone, and puts people off. So I don't know how other people perceive me, but certainly while I do occasionally crack and go, what the heck are you doing in that burial ground? Or like, that's like once every year. I mean, most of the time, I like people going to graveyards and engaging with it. And yes, I think there's so many ways that local preservation groups can draw on that interest, and the tragic lives, as you say, often working class lives, or whatever the story is behind the ghost story. Yeah, I don't see why not.
Yeah, I think you've tapped into kind of like the worst thread of the paranormal. That's arguably, like you say, the most prominent, certainly makes the most headlines. There is a real right-wing thread to the paranormal, especially in the UK. Like, I think so many people try and push this idea of para-unity, as they call it, which is lovely. It's very Care Bear. Let's all hold hands. We're all in it for the same reason. It's like, are we really? Because Dave here thinks he's talking to Genghis Khan, and Genghis Khan has got some big views on women's rights. So there's.
Oh my God, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. So like the ghosts are telling them, you don't want to worry about women, because Genghis Khan talked like that,
It was from the East End. Yeah.
Hey, don't all this woke agenda.
Yeah. But there really is, and that's it's very much grown in ferocity and prominence in recent years, where a lot of prominent social media paranormal personalities have come out expressing very right-wing, very damaging views, homophobic, sexist, racist, to audiences that continue to grow. So they're never, while that would have resulted in something generally with like old media, like with TV, radio, etc. Like, good luck trying to say that if you're on a contract with a production company. But considering a lot of these people are their own bosses, and we know that the world of social media is very much the Wild West, you can pretty much get away with anything. But there are so many instances, like you say, of people going into World Heritage sites and ancient tombs, literally into the tombs. And people have been doing that for centuries. And like take, I'm surprised. I think most, as obviously now an official archaeologist, I've got all the paperwork in the post.
Of course you are. Time Team Studies, archaeologist.
Thank you. Gold star. I think that most archaeologists, when they feel, like, I just want to watch something light and fresh, but also I might like a ghost story, they should watch Paranormal Egypt with Derek Akora. If you haven't seen it already, from that look, I don't think you have. I think the DVD box set is probably about £2, or I think most of them are on YouTube. Derek Akora jumps into, literally jumps into like tombs. I don't know the word of the stone bit that went around the sarcophagus. That was just the tomb itself, but he'd jump into those.
I forget the terminology. Egyptian archaeologists are their own niche. I forget all the terminologies. Yeah.
Well, he jumped into one of those and channeled the spirit of long. No, Sam was busy. Sam was at the gift shop.
Sam Hotep.
And was channeling ancient pharaohs. So and that's all beautifully filmed, lovely lighting, very confused tour guide. who I really wish they paid enough for that.
I shouldn't laugh. It's terrifying. It's really obnoxious.
It's amazing. It's amazing. There very much is the Church of Akora still, and I don't want to be on the receiving end of any backlash there. I'm fascinated by the man, and he's got an amazing, questionable legacy, which is what we all want, surely. But this idea of, prior to Derek going in and channeling pharaohs, I mean, that's a whole other discussion as well. That's a great British squiffy tradition. But
you can't blame him alone. It's not as if archaeologists haven't been doing it. So come on, let's be fair. Yeah, okay, go on. Sorry,
yeah. But people using these apps, so phone apps that work as word banks, or things like word banks that are devices with a set amount of however many thousand words in them, and we know what sort of words are usually programmed into them, and we'll go to a space, communicate, and then believe that the spirits will interact with that device in order to produce some kind of worthwhile communication. They'll either use word banks or spirit boxes, which are they're like radio hacks. It'll sound like a lot of white noise, and then in between, depending on the frequencies, people believe that spirits can manipulate the space between the radio frequencies to communicate words, sentences, phrases, intentions. You'll see a lot of those used in these instances where people are kind of paranormal ambulance chasers. You'll see it when people go to heritage sites, try and communicate with dead people of prominence or dead people of infamy, or even celebrities that whose deaths have just been announced. They'll go straight for these apps or these spirit boxes or word banks, because you can get that instant hit, you can get that instant commodification of an individual, and you can get that instant communication. And that's when we get to stages where words, intention, or even confessions of murder are put into people's mouths. And I think we're seeing that an awful lot now with the rise of the intersection of the paranormal and true crime as well, where you get someone will go missing and you'll have thousands of mediums on TikTok in the next second saying, I know where they are, and also I know who did it. So there's a real seedy underbelly to an awful lot of the paranormal. I think I'd be remiss to not acknowledge that. So while there is all the Care Bear, nice, good stuff, there is also that kind of, that dark underbelly.
And it's unpredictable because most of it, I mean, you can't police spaces and enthusiast spaces. And this is where I'm a bit wishy-washy, because I see there's a lot of angst amongst those spiritual communities, paranormal communities about, we've got wrong-uns in our midst. There'll always be wrong-uns. A number of archaeologists I know that I think, I respect their work, but my word, their opinions on X are so vile or something. You can't demarcate, and yet equally you can't ignore. You've got to speak up and out about these problems. But I mean, for me, that I think it's about trying to work out when it has real world harm and when it is that's just a bit weird. Okay, let's just not talk about that when we're talking. And that's really difficult to navigate, isn't it? And I see this with reenactment communities and living historians too, is which of the group are actually avid folkish pagans who believe or Odinists who also have some strange memorabilia from the Third Reich in the cellar or in the attic, and which are not. And what do you do about those when they suddenly, after 10 years, come out with these views? And when they listen to a podcast and I heard that women actually like all this abuse or something, you go, what the fuck? It's like where it can be unpredictable. It can percolate up, and it's not always that people have fixed views. And so I'm not saying this is a problem for particularly paranormal communities, but it's really difficult, isn't it, to know how to think through, well, when is this going to manifest as a problem where people are breaking and entering, or are they spinning a narrative that's really harmful from the dead, or just going to Egypt and doing a whole series? I didn't know about that.
Put it on your watch list. But it's I suppose it's just the nature of people, isn't it, that people are just inherently unpredictable. And as much as I've put certain investigators, dead or alive, on a real pedestal, and then have been very coldly brought back down to earth when I've realised that they deny my entire existence. Okay, well, that's great, Right, on to the next one.
Yeah.
Better crack on.
Yeah, yes. Never put, never, yeah, never meet your hero / cliche of never. Yeah, no, but it's true, isn't it? I mean, I can tell you a little anecdote for you. We don't have to finish here, but I have to share a little anecdote with you, which you could call paranormal humor. I don't know, but I was in the 1990s. I was part of as a student. I was part of a group of University of Reading archaeologists surveying the Clava cairns, the Balnuren of Clava monuments near Inverness, near the Culloden battlefield. And we used to have a lot of people go to Culloden and come to see us. And we had the American tourists going, "Is this where they buried Macbeth?" And we'd go, "Yeah." Because but we'd have all that. But one time we were using a Leica geodometer for our 3D recording of the monuments, and you could turn it on. You had an on setting that gave a variable frequency of the strength of the laser signal to the prism, and it was just like, and we had this guy meditating there for hours, and then he stormed up to us in absolute rage at us. He'd been meditating and he'd been chilling out. Lots of people come in. It's a free open archaeological site, and "It's you!" He went, "It's you!" And we went, "Sorry, hello, we're archaeologists from the University of Reading, we're just recording it." "It's your bloody machine making that noise. I thought I'd connected to something."
Oh, no.
And I said, "I'm very sorry, it's just our machine going like a theremin." So it's like, but no, we didn't, not mocking him, great. I mean, we wanted to help him, get in touch with those Bronze Age, ghosts, but or whatever he thought he was doing.
I think if you spend any time in burial sites for protracted amounts of time, you haven't really gained earned your pips until you've been mistaken for a ghost. I think it happens to the best of us.
Well, I think I've scared a few people coming out from court. Yes, I can't prove it because they've never admitted it. But then I've had the other extreme. Is one of my anecdotes I keep sharing is when I went to a national memorial, which I won't say where, and there was a woman who started a conversation with me about the dead and how they died, and I said it's a terrible loss of life. I thought it's the most neutral thing you can say. She went, "You know who I blame, don't you?" And I thought, hang on, who's this going to go? She's going to go to Al Qaeda or George Bush or the government or something. It could go any way here. I said, what do you mean? I said, "Who do you blame?" "I blame Gary Lineker."
Wow. So fair play.
Yeah, so Gary Lineker is responsible for the death of most British troops in Afghanistan, apparently, according to this lady.
Well, I think it's about time we held him responsible.
Him and his potato chips and his clean record of football. He's got a lot to answer for, that Gary.
Yeah.
No, but seriously, we haven't even talked about your book yet, and maybe we should have a separate whole discussion of your book, because I think it'd be great to record that maybe at another moment. But I don't know how you feel about that, I was wondering, maybe as a final sort of thought, so that I'd love to hear what you think about, because I think you're a great example of not only a great researcher, but also a great public face for this kind of field, and the way, at least I'm a fan of your TikToks, every one, including whether there's pets involved or there's your doglet comes along or not. But my point is, it's what do you feel has been the successes for you and the challenges? We've already talked about social media, but for you, what do you feel you've achieved with your social media that you'd say is good practice, or you feel has worked well, even if you don't particularly, nobody's ever happy with everything they do, but what do you think works well for you, and what do you think are the difficulties you faced?
Well, it's tricky really, because I've been running my blog for 10 years, and that's ticked along nicely. I've got really good readership. It goes up and down. And I never really focused on social media. And I've only really been, actively putting videos up probably the last 6 months or so.
Yeah.
And I like that everything I've done has been of a genuine interest. So a genuine interest in a burial site, in a historic ghost story, in a nugget of spiritualist history. Everything I've done is something that I will stand behind. I don't feel like I've done anything for the sake of views or clicks. But I also think that's probably why I haven't made tons of video content, and why I haven't kind of joined certain realms of paranormal TikTok or paranormal this or that, is that I'm not good at trends. I don't want to look very sad into my camera and then it cuts to an artifact of a dead woman.
Here's someone who died.
And I appreciate that works for so many people who are in history, archaeology, literature. I appreciate that works for them, and that's fine. If I was doing that, it makes my skin crawl, because it would be so inauthentic to me. And I'm not good at pushing myself forward to be the subject of something. I prefer to be someone, I prefer to be the toddler at the beach holding up the bucket of crabs going, look at these. I don't want to be there on the stage going, look at me. I'm very much, look at this thing, isn't it interesting? Look at this person, aren't they interesting? So I think that's where I'm in a happy place with my social media at the minute, is that everything I put up, I think has legs, and everything that I celebrate, I'm happy about. And I just don't think I'm ever going to fall into the realm of, doing trends and TikTok dances and looking sad in the British Museum. But, never say never. I might go wild
never.
One day.
I haven't resorted to the dances myself, but I have done occasional audio things. Lip syncs and stuff just for a laugh. But at the end of the day, yes, I think it's got to have integrity, and it's got to have, as you say, you've got to look back and say, yeah, that links to my interests, and I think that's really important.
So
go on.
Sorry. I think as well, maybe one of the things that holds me back in making a lot is that I want to make sure that every single thing I say is accurate. If I'm giving names, dates, places, reflections, things like that, I'm very, very meticulous with these things. So I'm not especially comfortable with just going out, seeing something and saying, oh, isn't this interesting? Because I'll want to give exact dates and things, and I'll want to cross-reference things with my library and things like that. So I think there's probably a less stressful way of doing it than I've chosen to go down. But like I say, the stuff on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, I think it's all just good fun, and I'm being authentic within it as well. I'm not being completely stuffy, which has been a tricky thing to get behind.
Well, Kate, it's been a fascinating series of topics to address with you, and I would love it if you'd be willing to come back and converse with me about your book as a dedicated, sort of separate discussion point. But for now, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your many insights and expertise with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for letting me jump from soapbox to soapbox. I appreciate it.
Follow Archaeodeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.